Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Soldier of Fortune for PC, Dreamcast, PlayStation 2, and Linux. What you're seeing here is the PC version. This is a first-person shooter developed by Raven Software and published by Activision in 2000 for PC, and it later saw a release on Dreamcast and PlayStation 2. It was generally rather well received on its launch and went on to spawn 2 additional sequels, those of course being Soldier of Fortune 2 Double Helix and Soldier of Fortune Payback. But none of those were as well received as the original title was, and they also weren't quite as controversial when they came out as the first one was. You see, Soldier of Fortune's claim to fame is not that it's a particularly great shooting game, but rather that it is a ridiculously violent shooting game. It features the Gore damage modeling engine, which allows for a ridiculous amount of dismemberment and graphic blood and guts being sprayed all over the place whenever you're eviscerating your foes. And while that would certainly be taken to new heights with the sequel, when this one came out, that was seen as absolutely abhorrent, and the game ended up getting banned in numerous countries. In fact, it got banned in more places than the sequel did. And this level of violence was so high that they decided to offer a version of the game that didn't have any of the graphic blood and guts in it, and it was called the Tactical Low Violence version. And no, I'm not making that up, that is the actual title of that version. Now, of course, it is worth noting that even if you do get the uncut version of the game, you can still enable the violence lock on it, so it's kind of a moot point, but I guess that option was there for the people who wanted it, which, honestly, I have no idea who that would be. But all that rambling aside, how does Soldier of Fortune fare against its contemporaries, and more importantly these days, how well does it hold up? Well, let's go ahead and delve into it and find out. Well, as far as presentation goes, it does run on the id Tech 2 engine, which is the Quake 2 engine, and it holds up surprisingly well to this day. Sure, the texture quality is very low res, and you've got some rather blocky modeling, but the animations are surprisingly detailed, and there are a lot of slighter touches here and there that really do make the game shine compared to a lot of other games of the era. Now that said, there is no real getting around the fact that by the time this came out, it was starting to look a bit dated because Quake 3 had already come out by that time, and the engine capabilities of Quake 2 were really at their absolute limits with this. Now, the real star of the show here is, of course, the Gore damage modeling engine, which has numerous points where you can dismember or otherwise eviscerate your opponents, where you can blow their limbs off, you can blast their head apart, you can blast them in the stomach and their intestines will start hanging out. And while at the time it was absolutely gruesome, there was always this sense that you really aren't supposed to take the game all that seriously. I mean, for example, when you whip out the shotgun, you flip it through the air and then catch it. It's just silly. A lot of the death animations are almost hilariously overdone to the point where an enemy will sit there and be crawling around for several seconds before they finally decide to expire. So really, instead of the gore being gruesome, it's just so over the top that it's silly. And that does give the game quite a bit of charm. Now that said, you will run into certain issues with the game's engine, namely the rendering distance, where sometimes you will find enemies that will be able to snipe you before you can even see them because the game isn't rendering them yet. I'll go into a bit more detail on that once I get to the gameplay section, but for now understand that it has to do with the way the game renders fog and the distance at which it will actually render characters, thus making it more of an engine problem than anything else. But apart from things like that, the visuals still hold up surprisingly well, although they definitely look extremely dated by modern standards, and they're not going to remotely impress you. Let's face it, 3D graphics from that relatively early era of the mid to late 90s, early 2000s really do not hold up very well in hindsight. What does usually hold up a bit better though is the sound design, which in this case is also true. The gun sounds in particular are nice and beefy, so you've got some very satisfying sounds when you take out, for example, the Desert Eagle, or the Silver Talon as they call it in the game, and blast an enemy's arm off with it, only to have it sound like you're shooting a hand cannon. Now, unfortunately, the explosion sounds aren't quite as up to snuff as the weapon sounds are, but the weapon sounds being beefy really does help things out quite a lot in the long run. I mean, hell, even the so-called weaker weapons sound powerful, so they definitely nailed that. Then, of course, there's the voice acting, which most of the time actually did not work on my system, and I'm not sure why. All the other sound came through the game just fine, all the music and the sound effects and everything, but the voice acting itself just wouldn't trigger most of the time, so I only got snippets of voice acting throughout the entirety of the game. And those few snippets were fairly cheesy and pretty indicative of 90s and early 2000s video game voice acting. Then of course there's the music, where the soundtrack is a fairly generic action movie soundtrack that works perfectly fine for the game, but is ultimately pretty forgettable. So when you bring everything together in terms of presentation, what really stand out are the gore effects and the sound effects for particularly weapons. But of course the graphics themselves are looking extremely dated, and some aspects of it don't really hold up well at all, while other aspects of, for example, the sound design don't even function anymore, but that's more of a result of trying to run this on modern computers than anything else. Here's the thing, what's ultimately going to make or break this thing for you is not going to be the presentation, because, I mean, this is a nearly 2-decade-old game at this point. Everybody knows that it's not going to be up to modern specs as far as graphics and sound goes, so what it's ultimately going to fall to are story and gameplay. And the story in this is that you play as mercenary John Mullins, who works for the shop along with his partner Hawk, and they go off to find some stolen nukes and bring the people who actually stole them to justice. The thing is that the plot never really gets any more complicated than that very simplistic summary, and you can see all of the twists and turns coming from a mile away. As a result, all the plot really serves to do is occasionally interrupt your gameplay so you can watch a fairly short cutscene, and also to give you some context as to what it is you're doing. And thankfully, not only are all of the cutscenes skippable if all you want to do is get to the gameplay, but they come at certain moments throughout the story where they actually do make sense. And none of them are particularly long, so they don't really have enough time to get on your nerves. Although there are a few levels in the game where there's absolutely nothing but dialogue for a couple of minutes before you move on to the next mission, which do get kind of annoying. But thankfully those are very few and far between, and the game ultimately focuses on its gameplay more than anything else. In that way, this is more of an old-school shooter, because it cares more about its gameplay than anything else, and the story and characters do suffer for it. In addition to the plot itself being simple and predictable, the characters are all pretty much just one note, and they barely have any vague semblance of personality to them, so it's pretty much impossible to get attached to any of them. So you'll probably notice very quickly that you start caring less and less about the story and characters and start getting focused more on the gameplay itself, which is somewhere between an old school shooter and a more modern shooter. Now the idea was that they were originally planning on making this a more realistic game, but they just didn't in the long run, and what you end up with is much more of a run and gun style than what you would later see in the series with Soldier of Fortune 2. That's not to say that it's entirely run and gun, because you do have a weapon limit. You have a certain number of slots in your inventory, and once those are full up, then you have to actually drop your current weapons in order to pick up new ones. You can still, of course, pick up ammo for any of the weapons, but if you don't have any inventory space, then it will tell you that you need to drop something in order to pick up something else. This may sound like it's a problem at first, but it turns out that pretty much all of the weapons in this game are actually satisfying to use. Even the basic 9mm pistol is actually surprisingly high damage. But of course there are quite a few more interesting weapons than your basic 9mm pistol or your basic submachine gun that you'll probably want to be using. Your arsenal consists of more conventional fare, like of course basic pistols, shotguns, sniper rifles, submachine guns, but there's also some more inventive stuff like the Flamethrower, which admittedly is still technically a conventional weapon, but it is more interesting than your basic shotguns and such. And of course the microwave gun and the slug thrower. The microwave gun is sadly less interesting than it sounds, because it basically cooks enemies from the inside out, but you don't really see anything on their actual character models, except that they just sizzle a bit. The slug thrower, on the other hand, shoots basically mini grenades, which do quite a lot of damage when they hit something, so that gets pretty satisfying. But the real star of the show here is, oddly enough, the shotgun, because it's good at medium and short range, especially at short range, and it absolutely tears enemies to shreds, both figuratively and literally. In other words, if you want to see the ghoul damage engine at its most glorious, then pick the shotgun and just run with it. And really, that's actually when the game is at its absolute best, when you're just running around blasting the living crap out of everything with a ridiculously overpowered arsenal. But here's the thing, you can really only do that on medium and easy difficulty. If you turn up the difficulty any higher than that, then you will immediately encounter the game's nastiest problems. The first problem is that on difficulties higher than medium, enemies have ridiculous amounts of accuracy and can just pick you off from half a mile away when you can't even see them. And that goes for both the actual soldiers running around on the ground and, of course, emplaced guns, which take a lot more damage to actually bring down than the actual soldiers do, and on top of that, they do an absolutely ridiculous amount of damage to you, to the point where you basically get hit once and instantly turn into mincemeat. Snipers are just as bad because even though they don't just tear you apart instantly, it only takes 2 shots from full health and armor to bring you down. The first shot will just take down the entirety of your armor and then about half or so of your health, and then the next shot will just take you down instantly. And again, they have pinpoint accuracy from half a mile away, which is a problem because they have more accuracy than the game is capable of rendering distance. You see, this is what I mentioned when I mentioned that there's an engine problem with regards to rendering. Now, in certain levels, the enemy snipers are so far away that you cannot actually see them. All you can see is fog, but they can see you and they can hit you just fine. Now on easy and medium, that's really not that much of a problem because they don't do so much damage that you go down in 2 shots, and they also aren't quite that accurate. In fact, if you play it on even the medium difficulty, then the game's honestly way too easy because the enemies barely even hit you at all. But then you turn up the difficulty to challenging, for example, thinking, oh, well, it's going to be challenging, and you find out very quickly that it is not challenging, but rather bullshit. The amount of times that the enemy will just mow you down before you even have a chance to react on even the challenging difficulty is insane. And to make matters worse, you have limited saves in this game. Now, on the challenging difficulty, you get 2 saves per level, meaning that you have to be very sparing with when you actually save your game and make sure that you're at a good spot to continue. And these levels can last a fair while. At least with 2 saves, you can just kind of correct things later on if the level tends to drag on for a while, but you still don't want to be using those saves unless you really have to. It's just this built-in aversion to using the saves just because you only have 2 of them per level and you don't want to waste one. So what's probably going to happen is that you might save in a particular location and then realize that that's an absolutely terrible spot to save, or you might not even save at all until you get to the point where you end up dying and have to start the entire level over again. It very quickly becomes absolutely infuriating to deal with because, again, the amount of bullshit deaths is pretty much off the charts even on the challenging difficulty, and on medium it's just so easy that you never die ever. Not to mention, on medium, you get more saves, so even if you do somehow manage to screw up and get yourself annihilated, then you can always just hop in there and save up to your heart's content. And therein really lies the problem. On medium and easy, the game is way too easy, and on challenging and higher, it's way too difficult, not because it's actually challenging, but because it will just annihilate you without you being able to react. Plus, of course, the issue with the limited saves, which is only an issue on challenging and higher. And thus, depending on which difficulty setting you play on, you're probably playing a completely different game, because on easy and medium, you just run through the levels, running and gunning to your heart's content, feeling like a total badass, and if you found that that was too easy, then you hop into the challenging mode and you find out very quickly the same run and gun style will not apply there, because you have to play it extremely slowly and methodically and creep around corners and use the lean function to an absolutely excessive degree just to survive an encounter. And the worst part is you won't find that until you hit the Siberia level and all of a sudden things get ridiculously difficult incredibly quickly and you just can't really deal with it. It just makes you wonder if anybody even bothered to playtest the harder difficulty settings, because it blatantly feels like the game was entirely built around being able to run and gun, to which the higher difficulty settings are completely anathema. And thus, it feels like this is 2 completely different games slapped together in one package. On the one hand, if you play it on easy and medium, it's a surprisingly fun run-and-gun shooter that's just too easy, but again, makes you feel like a total badass, because you're absolutely eviscerating everything in your path with glorious amounts of blood and gore. Meanwhile, if you play on challenging or hard, then you may as well be playing a torture device, because that's just how it feels. You just end up getting so angry at it that you want to put your fist through your monitor. And that ultimately makes the game a bit difficult to fully recommend, because even though it is a bit of a classic shooter and you do end up with some pretty viscerally satisfying combat, the lack of a sweet spot difficulty ultimately just makes it a very difficult sell, because if you play it on medium or easy, it is way too easy, and if you play it on challenging or hard, it's just unrelentingly bullshit. And as a result, the only people I can really fully recommend the original Soldier of Fortune to are fans of old school shooters who are willing to put up with that sort of thing, or people who already liked Soldier of Fortune 2 and want to see how the original game was. Beyond that, it really depends entirely on how much challenge you actually like in your first-person shooters. If you want something that is moderately challenging, then you won't find it here. But if you're an absolute masochist, then you'll probably be able to enjoy the higher difficulty settings, and if you're somebody who just wants some quick, silly fun, then you may be able to enjoy the lower difficulty settings. But as for a general first-person shooter audience, it's actually pretty difficult to recommend. Thanks for watching.